first heard Ludlow in the hesitation of an old miner, not in the reports, not in the anniversary speeches, but in the pause before he named the fire. He did not begin with the cellar or the dead. He began with tents that had become rooms, with children warned away from open ground, with women listening for horses before they listened for weather. The official record gives us April 1914, a strike colony, a battle, a burning. His memory gave something less orderly and more dangerous. The camp already understood it was being prepared for removal. The mistake is to begin with the pit. That is where the public mind is trained to begin, because the pit can no longer be softened. Women and children found beneath a burned tent. A cellar cut into the ground as shelter, then remembered as a grave. Once that image enters the story, everything before it begins to feel like approach, background, preface. The old miner did not remember it that way. He began before the fire had made the camp simple. He began with Ludlow as a place still trying to live, tents arranged with the stubborn logic of rooms, stovepipes pushed through canvas, blankets hung as partitions, coffee boiled in blackened pots, children stepping over ropes, and stakes as if they had inherited a street plan. It was not a town in the way a surveyor would recognize. But to the people inside it, it had already become a map. That distinction matters more than it first appears. By the winter of 1913 and the spring of 1914, the Colorado coal strike had pushed families out of company houses and onto exposed land near the southern coal fields. The official language calls Ludlow a tent colony, which is accurate and incomplete in the same sentence. A colony can sound improvised, temporary, almost accidental. What stood there was a displaced community built under pressure, close enough to the mines to remain visible, close enough to armed movement to remain vulnerable. Geography was not scenery. Geography was evidence. The camp sat where distance could be measured by dust. Riders approaching on the road changed the atmosphere before anyone spoke. Children learned which directions adults watched. Women learned the pauses between ordinary camp noise and the kind of quiet that made men step outside. The miner remembered those things because they belonged to the hours before history found its large words. Strike, disorder, battle. Each word would later do a portion of institutional work. Strike made the camp economic. Disorder made it unstable. Battle made the ground seem balanced, as if two comparable forces had met in open confusion. But Ludlow was not balanced ground. On one side were miners, wives, children, canvas, shallow shelters, and the exposed discipline of people who had already lost their houses. On the other were company interests, armed guards, state authority, and the kind of power that does not need to sleep near the place where its decisions collect. I want to be precise. A miner remembering years later is not a court transcript. Memory bends. Fear preserves some details and distorts others. The old man could have misplaced a rider, a shot, an hour, a name. But the value of his account was never that it solved every dispute. Its value was that it preserved the camp before the official record flattened it. The record can tell us that violence occurred. It can tell us that forces converged. It can tell us that the colony burned on April 20th, 1914. What it cannot easily hold is the condition of people who had been living for months, as if danger were already part of the architecture. The pits beneath the tents matter for that reason. They were not dramatic inventions added after the fact. They were practical spaces made by families who understood that canvas did not stop bullets. A camp with shelters dug under the floor is not a camp expecting ordinary negotiation. It is a community that has translated fear into construction. That is where the miner's testimony becomes difficult. He did not speak as if the day arrived suddenly. He remembered watching, He remembered warnings passed without ceremony. He remembered adults moving children before the children were told what to fear. He remembered the strange discipline of people who still cooked, still carried water, still tried to keep domestic order, while the armed world around them kept reducing that order to a problem. The newspapers and later summaries needed cleaner movement. They needed a strike that became a confrontation that became a fire that became a tragedy. That line is legible. It is also convenient. It leaves little room for the slower question: how long had Ludlow been treated, not as a settlement of families, but as an obstruction to be contained? The miner's memory stayed with that obstruction, not as theory, as placement, the tents on open ground, the ridge watched too often, the children called back from one side of camp, the men who looked toward movement before sound reached them. These small details do not prove a hidden order by themselves, but they do something official language dislikes. They restore sequence, and sequence is dangerous because it asks who had time to see what was happening. Before Ludlow burned, the camp had already been translated into the language of force. It was no longer merely a demand for wages, recognition, and dignity. It was a visible refusal outside company control, inhabited by families who made that refusal impossible to dismiss as rhetoric. The old miner remembered the camp before the flames because that was where the meaning still lived. The fire would come later. First came the watching. The word battle did not merely describe Ludlow. It organized Ludlow. A battle permits confusion. It allows two sides to disappear into smoke and motion. It makes broken bodies seem like the result of forces meeting, rather than decisions moving through men, weapons, property lines, and official orders. A battle can be tragic without being clear. That is why the word is useful. The old miner did not trust it. He remembered the day through position, not category. Where the armed line had been, where the tents opened, where the women moved when firing became more than threat, where children were lowered into pits that had been dug because the camp already understood what kind of argument it was living inside. That detail should stop us. A cellar beneath a tent is not normal domestic architecture. It is not the mark of a temporary camp at ease with its surroundings. It is an adaptation to violence before violence receives its public name. Those pits were made by people who had learned that danger might come horizontally, across open ground, and that the only available wall was earth. I want to be precise. Sequence alone does not prove intention. A first shot can be disputed. A command can be misheard. A frightened movement can be interpreted as aggression by men already prepared to see aggression. The record does not allow a single clean sentence in which every cause is fixed and every actor exposed. But that uncertainty does not make the official summary innocent. Uncertainty can be preserved because it is true. It can also be preserved because it is useful. The public record says violence broke out. The phrase has survived because it sounds neutral while refusing to answer the most important question. Broke out from where? From which side of the camp? From what order? What advance? What hour of watching? The phrase turned sequence into weather. Something gathered. Something happened. Then the tents burned. The miner's memory did not move that quickly. He remembered a camp already reading the edge of itself. Men watching beyond the tents. Women listening for changes in voice before they listened for gunfire. Children moved away from exposed places because the adults had learned that geography could become a weapon. None of this sounds like battle in the heroic sense. It sounds like people living under aim. Then the fire entered the record. Fire is a terrible witness because it destroys the evidence that gives testimony its shape. It does not only consume objects, it consumes arrangement. A tent is not just canvas. It is where a family slept, where a stove stood, where an entrance faced, where a child knew to crawl. When the canvas is gone, all those separate facts collapse into ash. The map becomes surface. That was what burning did to Ludlow. It made the camp easier to photograph and harder to reconstruct. The charred ground could be shown. The pit could be named. The dead could be counted. But the living order of the place, the sequence that tied one movement to another, became suddenly fragile. Fire gave the public an image so unbearable that the earlier machinery could hide behind it. This is not the same as saying the fire was planned in the simple way a melodrama would require. The evidence does not need that simplicity. The darker fact is that the camp had been made vulnerable long before flames moved through it. Families had been pushed into canvas. Canvas had been placed on exposed ground. Exposed ground had been watched by armed men. Armed men had been authorized by a world that already knew which lives were negotiable. The official language did not have to invent everything afterward. It only had to arrange emphasis. Battle before colony. Gunfire before eviction. Disorder before pressure. Fire before map. Once the order is arranged that way, Ludlow can be mourned without being fully studied. It becomes a disaster in the coal fields, not a demonstration of how private industrial power could borrow public force until no one could clearly say where one ended and the other began. The miner could still say where things had been. That is why his account matters, not because he saw everything. No one inside that smoke saw everything. Not because memory is pure. It is not. His account matters because it refused the cooling effect of official words. It kept returning to the ground before it was reduced to aftermath. It kept insisting that tents had doors, that pits had purposes, that children had been moved for reasons adults understood before historians named the day. The cellar pit became the symbol because it could not be made ordinary. Women and children dead beneath a burned tent. The sentence still arrests the body. But even the most horrifying symbol can narrow a story if it gathers all attention into itself. The public can grieve the pit and still fail to ask why families were living above it. That is how memory is managed without appearing to be managed. Not by erasing the dead, by isolating them, not by denying the fire, by letting the fire explain too much. After Ludlow burned, grief entered faster than clarity. Statements could be issued. Responsibility could be argued in broad terms. Newspapers could arrange the event for readers who would never smell the smoke or see the ground. The dead became undeniable, but the sequence remained vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, the old miner's memory became inconvenient. He remembered the before. He remembered the watching. He remembered that the camp did not feel surprised by danger, only by the final form danger took. Afterward, the ruins were easier to handle than the camp. A ruin can be photographed. A ruin can be entered into reports. A ruin can receive flowers, speeches, anniversaries, and the controlled mercy of public grief. Ludlow as ash could be administered. Ludlow as a living colony that remembered being watched before it burned was much harder to contain. The official aftermath did not need to deny the dead. The dead were undeniable. The ground had become a witness. There were blackened tent frames, collapsed stoves, open pits, names spoken by families who did not require a committee to tell them what had been lost. They had seen the places, and the places still answered. Denial would have looked obscene, so the work became arrangement. That mattered later. The event could be called tragedy. It could be called industrial violence. It could be folded into the larger history of the labor conflict and made to stand there, grave and useful, as proof that the old coal fields had been brutal places. All of that is true. It is also incomplete in the exact way official memory prefers. Because the sharper question was never only whether Ludlow happened. It was whether Ludlow would be allowed to remain complicated enough to accuse the systems around it. The miner understood this without using institutional language. He did not speak of narrative control. He spoke of men who sounded certain too quickly. He spoke of explanations arriving while smoke was still part of the air. He spoke of survivors being asked, subtly or directly, to place their memories inside words already prepared for them. Battle, riot, tragedy, unrest. Each word preserved something and buried something. The public could mourn women and children in a pit. It could condemn excess, could pity the miners. But it did not have to study with the same intensity how private industrial power had borrowed public force, or how families came to be living above holes dug into the earth because canvas had become their last wall. That is what the miner's memory kept returning to. Not a grand theory, not a perfect transcript. A map, the tents before they burned, the edge of camp watched too often. Children moved before the danger was named. Adults listening to distance as though distance itself had turned hostile. That is the difference between record and witness. What survived was not enough, but it was not nothing. The photographs survived. The testimony survived in fragments. The name Ludlow survived in labor halls, family stories, memorial ground, and the older anger of people who knew the fire had explained too much. The ashes cooled, the report settled, the monument rose, but somewhere beneath the official sentence, the miner remains before the flames, hearing canvas move in the wind, watching men who understood the map and waiting for history to pretend it arrived suddenly. Ludlow did not burn only when the tents caught fire.